This is just a sample of the audiobook. To get the complete audiobook, access the link posted in the first comment.
Or piazza, at the rear, on the third-floor level. Enclosed with a 9-foot wooden railing, it had been a bedroom before the Roosevelts tore out the back wall and converted it to an open-air playroom. It overlooked not only their own and neighboring yards, but the garden of the Goulet mansion on 19th Street, one of the largest private gardens in the city, within which roamed numbers of exotic birds with their wings clipped. Daily, in their piazza clothes, the children were put out to play, or, in Bammy's case, in early childhood, to lie on a sofa. The house had been a wedding present from Cornelius von Schack Roosevelt, CVS to the family, whose own red brick mansion on Union Square, 6 blocks south, was the figurative center of the Roosevelt tribal circle. The father of 5 sons, CVS had presented them all with houses as they married, and the one given Theodore, youngest of his 5, adjoined that of Robert B. Roosevelt, the 4th son, who was a lawyer. With their full beards and eyeglasses, these 2 neighboring brothers bore a certain physical resemblance. The difference in age was only 2 years. Beyond appearances, however, they were not the least alike. Robert was the conspicuous, unconventional Roosevelt, the one for whom the family had often to do some explaining. Robert wrote books. Robert was bursting with ideas. He was a gifted raconteur, a sportsman, yachtsman, New York's pioneer conservationist. Fish were his pet concern, an enthusiastic cook, an authority on family origins. He was loud and witty and cherished the limelight, seeking it inexplicably in the tumult of Tammany politics. Until the Civil War, the Roosevelts had all been Democrats. As late as 1863, Theodore had still been an avowed war Democrat, one who supported the war, and thus the Republican administration. But when he and the rest of CVS's line at last turned Republican, Robert alone remained in the Democratic fold, and was never to be anything but proud of the fact. Our party is the party of the people. Robert's middle name was his mother's maiden name, Barnhill, but in anticipation of what his political foes might make of this, manure pile or variations to that effect, he had it changed to Barnwell, and it was as Uncle Barnwell that he was sometimes known to the small nieces and nephews in the house beside his. Robert's wife, Elizabeth Ellis Roosevelt, was called Aunt Lizzie Ellis, to distinguish her from still another Aunt Lizzie in the family, and she too was considered unorthodox. At the back of her 3rd floor, the floor corresponding to the piazza next door, she maintained a marvelous and odorous menagerie of guinea pigs, chickens, pigeons, a parrot, a monkey, everything under the sun that ought not be kept in the house. The monkey, her favorite, was a violent little creature that bit. She dressed it like a fashionable child, complete with ruffled shirts and gold studs. Once Aunt Lizzie Ellis aroused the neighborhood with the purchase of a cow that had to be led from East 20th Street into her backyard by the only available route, through the house, an event that, for excitement, was surpassed only by the removal of the cow, once Aunt Lizzie Ellis was threatened with legal action. On the return trip through the house, the animal became so terrified it had to be dragged bodily, its legs tied, its eyes blindfolded. To the children next door, such occasions naturally figured very large, as did Uncle Barnwell with his talk of fishing and hunting, his yacht, and his flashy political friends. So it is somewhat puzzling that so little was to be said of him in later years. His immediate proximity would be passed over rather quickly, his influence barely touched on. He is the Roosevelt everybody chose to forget about. Politics undoubtedly had much to do with this, but more important, it would appear, was his private life. For in addition to all else, Brother Rob was a bit lax in his morals. He was what polite society referred to as a bohemian, the kind of man who kept company with actresses and such. An admiring later-day kinsman would describe him as an Elizabethan in the Victorian era, and a story has come down the generations of the ladies' gloves Robert purchased in bulk at A.T. Stewart's department store, these in a violent shade of green. The gloves had been on sale, according to the story, and he distributed them liberally among his lady friends, with the result that for years those who knew him well knew also to watch for the gloves while strolling Fifth Avenue or driving in the park. Ordinarily, such stories might prompt some question as to whether Robert only seemed scandalous. So very straight-laced was the family, so quick was the best society to leap on the least deviation from the prescribed code and call it, if not immoral, then indecent. But in truth, Robert was something more than a mere rake or charming boulevardier. He was a man living a remarkable double life, keeping another woman and ultimately an entire second family in a house only a block or so distant on the same street, an arrangement that would come to light only long afterward as a result of genealogical research sponsored by some of his descendants. Her name was Minnie O'Shea, or Mrs. Robert F. Fortescue, as he had decided she should be called, and in 1869 she was already pregnant with their first child. How much of this Theodore knew, how strenuously he disapproved, if at all, is impossible to say. But the contrast between the two could hardly have been more striking. Theodore was invariably upright, conservative, the very model of self-control. He cared nothing for public acclaim, never put himself forward, as friends would remember. Theodore was the model, duty-bound husband and father, a junior partner at Roosevelt & Son. He was a faithful communicant at the Madison Square Presbyterian Church, who often attended 2 services on the same Sunday. He belonged to the Union League Club and the Century Association. He served on charitable boards, raised money for museums. Not in 7 generations on the island of Manhattan had the Roosevelts produced so sturdy or so winsome an example of upper-class probity, or so fine a figure of a man, physically imposing, athletic with china blue eyes, chestnut hair and beard, and a good, square Dutch jaw. In his formal photographs, the eyeglasses removed, he is someone who will do what he has to, direct, sure of himself. Only the eyes raise questions with their unmistakable hint of severity, which seems odd in a man remembered mainly for the sunshine of his affection. Clothes concerned him. The choice of a suit, the right hat for the occasion, were issues of consequence. His suits were of the best quality and beautifully tailored. Appearances mattered. Indeed, it may be said that appearances figured quite as much in the life at 28 East 20th Street as everywhere else within the circumscribed world of New York's good old families. Did I tell you that he took the other end of the table at the dinner I gave to Captain Cook, and behaved admirably? Theodore writes of Brother Rob to Mittie. He was dressed perfectly, except for a colored cravat with his dress suit. Together at dinners and balls, he and the exquisite Mittie made a picture people did not forget. It was in the Roosevelt tradition to be solicitous to women. While their mother was alive, the 5 brothers stopped regularly every morning en route to work to pay her their respects. But Theodore seems to have genuinely preferred the company of women. He had an eye for feminine beauty, his children all remembered, and the attention he showered on Mittie was exceptional even for that day and those circles. An employee at one of his charities remarked that he had never understood the meaning of the word gentleman until the evening he watched Theodore Roosevelt escort his wife about the premises. In all, Theodore was a seemingly uncomplicated person. He had no particular gifts. He was not musical, as Mittie was. He shared little of her love of art. He was not creative. He did not write or charm after-dinner audiences, as Robert could. He dabbled in nothing. He was perfectly intelligent, to be sure. He enjoyed books, enjoyed the talk of lawyers, editors, and others who traded in words and abstract ideas, but he was unintellectual. In matters of taste, he habitually deferred to his wife, refusing even to buy a bottle of wine unless she had passed on it. If he regarded himself as an authority on anything, it was horses. But the greatest of all was his interest in and feeling for children. He responded immediately to them, and they to him. My personal impression, a nephew would recall, is that he was a large, broad, bright, cheerful man with an intense sympathy with everything you brought to him. He loved children especially. From childhood he had been called Thee, and as the youngest son, the Benjamin of the family, he had been doted on. He was Mamma's darling, and did nothing but shine in her eyes until her dying day. In turn, he adored her, and would credit any good qualities he had to her and her settled notions. She had been an event in the Roosevelt line, the first non-Dutch entry on the family tree. She was Margaret Barnhill of Philadelphia, Her background was English-Irish Quaker. She was gentle,